raw flesh. Sounds kind of gross, right? Actually, the neighboring Indians gave the Eskimos this name when they came over 4,000 years ago. There are several different kinds of Eskimos, and they've all kind of settled in different parts of the world. They've settled between Canada, Greenland, Alaska, and the peninsulas in North Nebraska, as you can see in the PowerPoint. Some different names of Eskimos can be Siberian, St. Lawrence Island, Caribou, and the Alaskan, which is pretty typical. These are just some of the names, they're not all of them. And from years ago until today, Eskimos have really changed the way they live and how they live. Most people think that they lived in igloos, but that's not actually the case. It's surprising how differently that they lived than what we thought. And aspects of other cultures are actually really small compared to, like, say, a Hmong culture. Some adopted the name Inuit, but not all of them have stuck with this name. Some Eskimos find it offensive, actually, if you call them Eskimos and not Inuits anymore. And even between all the different groups, they generally practice the same thing. It's just kind of where they all ended up settling in. Such things that they are the same as hunting. They use the same guns, bows and arrows and such. And they all find it really important not to waste any part of the animal when hunting. The neighboring Indians actually didn't agree with how they ate the animal, and some of the animals ate and fished. Hunting was so important to them, and that's what they depended on to live because they had no other food source. One of the biggest hunting things they did was right before it got really cold, they'd wait for the seals to come up and take a breath between the ice chunks, and when the seals come up, then they would shoot them. And it was right away important for the little boys how to use a gun because they had to learn to keep feeding the family and the children. As thought before, Eskimos didn't really have a permanent home. They kind of just would make a camp every winter, and they'd hunt some seals and caribou to last them as long as possible. And as soon as spring began, they'd pack up wherever they were camping and head off to better hunting ground. In the winter, it was just so cold that it was really hard for them to find good hunting. And the igloo actually to an Eskimo means home, and it's not the snow structure that we've always pictured an igloo being. And the homes that they had were usually made of canvas that they'd gotten from the trading posts from other people. And for warmth, they'd use caribou skins, and they'd also wrap up the babies in that, or use it as blanket, or just plain sit on it on the ground. For religion, Eskimos generally use shaman religion, and they practice rich mythology, which they think everything is imbued with spirits, and spirits mean everything to them. And just like any other culture, they have several holidays that really bring on the spirits. They would have traditional feast times and ritual dances, and they dress up and have drums and reciting of verse stories. And some dances represented different things like the caribou hunt, some would portray the flight of birds, and others were the battles with the weather. And for the most part, these feasts would take place in the spring or winter, and that was their big hunting time. The spring was the whaling festival, and after they had a big whaling festival, it was like Thanksgiving to us was their feast, and at this time they would celebrate and then ask for good fortunes with next year's hunt. And along with hunting, they used the animals that they would kill as tools, cooking oil, and they'd make clothing out of the animal hide. For the clothing, they would wear tan seal or tan caribou skins, and they'd use the fur of the animal as the trim along the hood or the other trim on the bottom of their clothing. And the shoes were also made of skin, and to toughen them, the women would actually chew on the edges and then sew the two seams together. And that's another thing, as a little girl, you had to learn how to sew as soon as you were old enough because sewing shoes was a big thing to take to the trading post. Now down parkas have kind of replaced the hide coats, and the traditional clothing is actually now considered an art and is displayed in museums and sold for a lot of money. As you can see in the PowerPoint, the difference between the older clothing and the newer clothing, there's some pattern on the newer clothing rather than just the tanned hide. And along with making clothing for just themselves, the women would make the articles of clothing to bring to the trading market, to bring and have them buy something else that the family really needed, like other tools, sometimes money, or the canvas, which was really important to them. Excuse. The trader would bring the clothing, and they'd look over it and figure out what he needed, and then they'd go from there, and then they would trade for the canvas or whatnot. The trader would then bring the clothing that they brought, and he would sell it to more populated areas like in Alaska. Traveling for Eskimos was really difficult. They had dog sleds, and their 2 feet was basically all they had. The dog sleds was pulled by a team of dogs, and it was sled that could hold a certain amount of weight. They didn't have a lot of options, so when they wanted to move, they had to pack up everything and then give the dogs several breaks. And it was really hard in the cold weather because the dogs would be really cold, and they were the only domesticated animals that these Eskimos had at this time, and they weren't that nice. They were part wolf, which made it really difficult to use them sometimes, but this is all that they could depend on. As you can see in the PowerPoint, the differences between today's travel, which now they use ATVs and snowmobiles to get around, and it's a lot easier and a lot faster for them, as to part of the dog sled that they would use. A lot of things have changed since the Eskimos have started here. They no longer live in the small bands with the one leader. They now live in settled communities and are very widely dispersed. About 25 to 30,000 are now living in Alaska, with other groups settled still in Canada and Greenland. You can kind of see on the PowerPoint on the map where they've settled in the Greenland areas. They've come a long way, and they've really domesticated almost since that they started. They were only in their own little world type with hunting and everything, and now that they can eat our food almost, and they don't have to depend on just hunting to survive, they've adapted a lot better in the past years in the way that we live now. Some of my references include education.yahoo.com, everyculture.com, and YouTube/Eskimo in the search bar.